All right, so I want to talk a little bit right now about the relationship between Saturn and Uranus. And then I want to link that to, I guess you could say, the ongoing evolution of the global economy, and particularly the relationship between something like capitalism and Marxism or socialism. Richard Tarnas, interestingly enough, said that the relationship between Saturn and Uranus is the primary, he uses this word specifically, the primary dialectical tension in the universe. And of course, this is the term Marx uses as well to describe the evolution of capital. So the question is, which, if Uranus and Saturn, archetypally speaking, are representing, you could say, the dialectical motion between capitalism and socialism or Marxism, the question is which one is which, right? And I think the answer is it depends on when you're asking the question. That's the whole point. They kind of leapfrog each other historically. And this goes to the very heart of how archetypes, eternal structures that exist exterior to planet Earth, when they penetrate into the biosphere, when they are enacted in historical conditions and individual psyches, you could say like a torsion process happens, or like that which is pure archetypally, when it incarnates in historical conditions, that purity doesn't translate necessarily. So let's go back to the 1840s and in the 1850s when Marx was writing, and let's just look at how Saturn and Uranus may have presented themselves archetypally in that specific historical situation. So what's interesting about capitalism, I think, is that the way it is usually presented is that it is a reactionary force, right? And in that sense, of course, Saturn is the ultimate reactionary archetypal principle. But yet, when you listen to Marx talk about capitalism, and particularly in the Communist Manifesto, I mean, there's this famous passage when he talks about how, capitalism, it destroys the old feudal ties and just kind of rips through things, right? That's not Saturn at all. Capitalism, in terms of its industrialization, when it was moving through rural Europe, when it was taking in the peasants from the countryside, bringing them into these big factories and the new industrial cities that were emerging throughout Europe, that is totally Uranian. In that situation, Saturn is more representative of the old agricultural order of feudal Europe. That is Saturn. It's the entrenched power that is, again, not Saturn itself, but the way Saturn incarnates in historical conditions, right? So in this situation, that is to say the mid-19th century, Saturn is more representative of the old the entrenched system of power, you can say. And at that time, it was still agricultural based. It was feudal based. Like the emergent democracies that were, of course, associated with industrialization and the nascent power of capitalism, that's the Uranian feature, right? So in this sense, capitalism is incredibly Uranian. It's ripping through whatever pre-existent model is there, socially, economically, and politically, to reterritorialize, or to start something new in terms of production, in terms of distribution, in terms of capital allotment, so on and so forth. Now, let's look at the situation today. It's really interesting. When we think of, let's say, the old economic order, what do we think of? We think of factories. We literally think of what was once Uranian, right? So now, what was once Uranian, let's say certainly in the 19th century, but even in the early 20th century, is now Saturn, right? Saturn is like the old industrial order, right? It's fixed, it's immovable, it's referencing, it's referencing all the predicates and archetypal associated tendencies of Saturn. And now, what is Uranian? It's the digital world. Really, the Uranian influence breaking through the industrial structure of Saturn probably really emerged in the mid-1990s with the democratization of the internet. But now we're coming to an even much more extreme Uranian processes, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the kind of global interconnection of society through networks. That's totally Uranian. And then in 50 years from now, these Uranian technologies will be Saturn, and there'll be new. This is the idea. The idea is that Saturn and Uranus kind of leapfrog each other. They're constantly in this battle of Saturn sets the rules of the game. It delineates a structure. Uranus pierces through the structure and breaks new ground, opens up new space by which something new can emerge, a new order can emerge. Then, what Uranus had broken through, that new order begins to consolidate itself. It begins to have structure, it begins to have boundaries, it begins to set a new rhythm, a time rhythm, and then all of a sudden it becomes Saturnian again. And then the process repeats itself. Uranus breaks through. And literally, when you look at the historical process or the historical evolution of, let's say, industrialization, and then into post-industrialization, that is literally charting the archetypal relationship between Saturn and Uranus, or I should say Saturn to Uranus, Uranus becoming Saturnian again, and then Uranus breaking through to something else. And this process is going to continue itself. You know, it's really interesting. I think of a city like Lowell, Massachusetts, Lowell, Massachusetts, and really, New England. We don't really think of New England as an industrial center, but in many ways it was the first industrial center, right? Places like Lowell, Lawrence, Biddeford, Maine, there, Pawtucket, Rhode Island. There are a lot of these small really textile manufacturers first and foremost. And that, of course, as America moved westward, you get Detroit, you get Pittsburgh, you get these much, much, much bigger centers. But Lowell, Massachusetts, when it was first literally created in the early 19th century, it was a unbelievably progressive, borderline utopian type of situation. Charles Dickens, the British novelist, when he came to America, he made some famous remark that Lowell was one of the most interesting cities he'd ever seen. But that's Lowell in its Uranian emergence as a center of industry. And of course, Lowell had a very interesting employment arrangement, employing young girls from the New England countryside to work in the mills. Now, if you went to Lowell today, well, Lowell's changed a little bit over the past 10 years. It's become it's followed a kind of a similar model to a lot of these old mill towns in New England that really kind of fell apart after the Second World War. And they've made a bit of a resurgence, you could say, over the past, let's say, 15, 20 years, turning the old mills into condos and so on and so forth. But still, though, the idea is that you would look at Lowell today and you would not think of it at all as being Uranian. That is to say, like Silicon Valley or Manhattan or kind of these Uranian centers. You would look at Lowell as like an old, kind of rusty industrial town that's kind of lost its glory. But that's the idea. The idea is that what was once Uranian will become Saturnian, right? And then what was once Saturnian will eventually break through into a new Uranian horizon. And this is, I think, the idea that's, definitely Richard Tarnas tries to outline in his book, Prometheus the Awakener. But it's also, in a way, weirdly enough, the way Marx frames the ongoing dialectical relationship between these forces. And this, so this brings us to the question, is capital Saturnian or Uranian? Both, simultaneously. And in many ways, it is a conflict. You could actually say that capital itself is the conflictual relationship between Saturn and Uranus. It's both and neither at the same time, right? So it's holding the space for this continual dialectical, that's the key word, dialectical evolution between these archetypal forces that incarnate in historical conditions and manifest in varying economic processes that collide and evolve and create all types of new things, whether it be products or supply chains or industries or so on and so forth, but also resistance at the same time. This is the key thing, right? This is the key thing. Saturn and Uranus resist each other fundamentally. They are, Saturn has a unique relationship. All planets have unique relationships with each other, right? But Saturn particularly, because Saturn was the boundary. Up until 1781, when Uranus was discovered, Saturn was the boundary of the solar economy, and it was the boundary of consciousness. When you get Uranus in 1781, when you get Neptune in 1846, when you get Pluto in 1930, you start to pierce through what was once the limit of human consciousness, and you start to break into higher, I don't know, vibrations, you could say, higher structures of thought, but also opening a space for human evolvement, really, the spiritual evolvement of the human race. Not to sound dramatic, but that's really what it is. This is why Dane Rudyard called the trans-Saturnian bodies ambassadors to the galaxy. See, but when we get out there, we're beyond not only ourselves, but in many ways we're beyond the given political economy of planet Earth. This is very important. Now, Saturn has very unique relationships with all. There are many trans-Saturnian bodies when you take into account Chiron and the, you know, like like Eris and Ixion. But anyway, just to stick with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as they're the three main ones. Saturn has a very interesting relationship with all three of them. They're very different. You know, Saturn and Pluto is a very, you could almost say, a violent relationship where Saturn is repressing this elemental plutonic force that's emerging upwards, right? So Saturn tries to control Pluto. The Saturn-Neptunian relationship is also very different because Saturn, you have this kind of mass, this solid mass that demands structure, that demands temporal and spatial boundaries. And then with Neptune, you have this kind of watery, gaseous power that kind of subverts Saturn without Saturn even knowing it, right? It kind of just goes into Saturn. And it's really a very, I think, difficult relationship, to be honest with you. And we're actually coming into that, of course, right now with the 2025-2026 Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And this is, of course, an important one because it's exactly at 0 degrees Aries, which is going to up the ante big time in terms of how those planetary, in terms of how those archetypes interact in terms of conjunction. Then you have Saturn-Uranus, and this is, to me, it's the most unique one. I think Saturn-Pluto is probably a very dramatic one. But I think Saturn and Uranus is the most unique because they're literally opposites. See, Saturn and Pluto aren't necessarily opposites. I don't know how I would describe them geometrically. And Saturn and Neptune aren't necessarily opposites either. But I think they're different, but I don't necessarily think they're opposites. With Saturn and Uranus, you get something that resembles a total opposite, right? A dialectical process, you could say. Saturn wants structure, it wants form, and Saturn reacts to novelty. It's skeptical of novelty. It gets its power through the maintenance of tradition, through the reproduction of a social, you could say, atmosphere that it is relatively in control of. Uranus is the ultimate outlier. It's the ultimate individual. It's the ultimate agent that refuses subsumption into a set superstructure. Uranus is the rebel, it's the James Dean, the rebel without a cause of the solar economy. It demands individuality, it demands definitely eccentricity. Uranian people they're kind of weird, they're different. And I don't mean weird in a way we think of it as being like, what I would say is they march to the beat of their own drummer. They're not regulated by the social rhythm imposed on, like, see, most people have a Saturnian, they adhere themselves to the Saturnian superstructure. And this is totally irrelevant if they're Geminis or Cancers or whatever. Saturn is calling the shots when we're dealing with baseline consciousness of planet Earth. When you get Uranus involved, it's not playing by those rules. So it's piercing through. It's always trying to exit, pierce through, disrupt the Saturnian system and exit, right? Now Saturn doesn't like this, right? And this is kind of how I charted that relationship in a macroeconomic sense, right? So that's the relationship between Saturn and Uranus. You have a structure and you have this kind of renegade individual that's looking to create something new. And that tension, when you apply it to a macroeconomic process, it does indeed produce something that's, I would say, very similar. And in many ways, you know, this is a very interesting thing. Marx, of course, was a materialist, not in the sense of, you know, Richard Dawkins or some kind of a vulgar materialist, but he was a materialist, even though there is you could say, this kind of, there's a cosmicness, there's a vision to Marx's materialism that's not reduced to just matter. There's something else there, even though he was by no means a spiritual person. Now, you know, these archetypes, whether you believe and whether you recognize them or not, they're there. Whether you know, I mean, I don't know, to be honest with you, what Marx thought of astrology. I don't know if there's any literature on that. I don't know if he's ever wrote about that, but I would imagine he would have rejected something like that wholesale. I would imagine that he would have thought that those planetary bodies have nothing to do with the material evolution of society, right? Marx is a materialist. So, but yet, in many ways, Marxism itself, as a massive theoretical edifice, is in fact an attempt to theorize that relationship between Saturn and Uranus. That's what it is. And I think this is very important to have it. And again, not to take away or displace a kind of a, I guess you could say, I'm by no means a Marxist, and I don't particularly like him, but at the same time, I do take him seriously, because you have to take him seriously. You know, I'm not saying we should just focus on the astrology. I think it's good to have different discourses running side by side and see what we can learn from each other. But that's the idea. That's the idea, in particularly right now. So what's happening right now? Well, all of these technologies that have emerged over the past, really since the end of World War II. I mean, you know, you have a place like Silicon Valley, you have a place like Route 128 outside of Boston that took all of the kind of MIT grads and Harvard grads and made all these new technologies. But so what I'm getting at, the Uranian disruption of, or how should I frame this? See, the Industrial Revolution was in fact a Uranian phenomenon when it occurred in the 19th century. But as it started to consolidate itself, as it became the standard of the global economy and of capitalism itself, it started to become it started to become Saturnian at some point. And by the end of the Second World War, now you're starting to get these microelectronic technologies involved. You're starting to get these new technological processes that are disrupting the way industrialization had worked for the past 100 years. At that point, things kind of switch. Now industry is becoming Saturnian. It's crystallizing itself as a Saturnian edifice. And these new technologies that are starting to break down or challenge, you could say, industrialization, that's the Uranian element. And this, by the time we get to the 90s, with the introduction of the internet, and now in the situation right now, we're kind of going through a similar situation where Facebook and Amazon and whatever, Tesla and all of these big Silicon Valley companies, on the surface, they're Uranian, right? Because they're innovating, they're changing, they're disrupting. I mean, these are all Uranian characteristics, but yet they're consolidating themselves into massive corporate bodies. They're trademarking their technology, they're copywriting their productive, I mean, they're doing all of these Saturnian things to crystallize themselves. So we're coming to a very interesting situation where the dialectic is literally in motion, where all of those kind of post-war technologies that accelerated the 90s and that really accelerated after 2008 and the financial crisis, they're undergoing a process where they're switching now from Uranian technologies into Saturnian technologies in the same exact way the initial forces of the Industrial Revolution, which were absolutely Uranian in relationship to the Saturnian agricultural order, in relationship to the old dying feudal order. They were Uranian in the 19th century, and then by the time, let's say the 1920s, 1930s, and into World War II, then they become Saturnian. They become hegemonic. They become crystallized. So this is what's happening right now. Now, the question is, what will be the new Uranian technology? Who knows? But we're going to see that, though. That's the idea. So this is an ongoing evolution, not just of capital and the forces that resist it, not just of the internal contradictions of technology, right? Because technology and capital, by definition, evolve because of their contradictory nature. But it's the same, but this is the thing, it's like Saturn and Uranus, which in many ways, not in many ways, they do supersede these economic and social and technological processes. It's the ultimate contradiction. It is the contradiction, and this contradiction is inside of all of us. And it's certainly inside of the systems and the technologies and the macroeconomic processes that we invent collectively. So that's what I would say about that.